Welcome to the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. I'm James Hazelwood, author, bishop, and spiritual companion, bringing you interviews and information at the intersection of a gritty Christian mysticism and depth psychology. You can find all the episode show notes, as well as my free Substack newsletter, Notebooks, at jameshazelwood.net. Now, on to the show. Welcome to this special edition of the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. My guest today is Joanna Penn. She's the host of the Creative Penn podcast, also the author of numerous both nonfiction books, primarily for authors in the independent publishing field, but also fiction books that are, I would describe as Laura Croft meets Dan Brown. And most of her fiction includes kind of subplots dealing with history, culture, spirituality, psychology. Fascinating. In fact, one of her books early on, and we'll talk about this in the interview, deals with Carl Jung's The Red Book. Joanna's new book is called Writing the Shadow: Turn Your Inner Darkness into Words. And it's only available right now as a part of a Kickstarter campaign. And I'll include all the links in the show notes if you're interested. It'll come out later via all the other avenues for books. This is a wonderful book because it not only describes Carl Jung's theory of the shadow, dealing with the unconscious material within all of us and within humanity collectively, but it's also an application book, and it has some great tools for how you can connect with your shadow side for creativity. Now, it's principally focused for writers, but I think it has application to other people in any creative field. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation with the author, Joanna Penn. We spoke via Zoom. She was in England. I happened to be on the West Coast on a trip, so we connected over the internet. Amazing how that can happen. The internet. Have you heard of this thing? Anyway, here's the conversation. Joanna Penn, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jim. I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, great. So people that will be listening to this podcast, I think many of them are going to be familiar with some of the subjects that we're talking about, but they're not going to be familiar with you, who you are. And so just tell us a little bit about, who you are, what you do, and where you are.
Sure. So I guess the headline is I write thrillers and dark fantasy and crime as J.F. Penn. And I have a background in psychology and religion, which all comes out in my fiction. And I also write nonfiction self-help as Joanna Penn, of which this Writing the Shadow book is one in a long series. And I have a podcast, or a couple of podcasts, but the Creative Penn podcast, of which I know you're a listener. And and I guess I should say I also have a pilgrimage memoir, which is called Pilgrimage, if people are interested in that. And I have been a full-time independent author for 12 years. And before that, I was an IT consultant. I used to implement accounts payable into corporates. So I guess I've come from corporates and I've moved into writing and business. I run my own publishing company. And so I kind of bring all of those things together, but I also write a lot of fiction. I've got around 45 books now. So I've been writing a while.
You're such a slacker. I really wish you would produce a little bit more. And clearly from your accent, most people listening to this podcast are going to be here in the United States. Where do you live?
Oh, yes. So I live in Bath, which Americans might know as Bath, in the southwest of the UK. It's famous. It is Roman baths, which are sort of 2,000 years old, medieval abbey. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein here. Jane Austen famously hated Bath, but it's got a lot of Georgian architecture. And they also filmed some of Bridgerton here. So any romance fans will enjoy the Bridgerton show on Netflix. So it's a very beautiful area, but yes, with a long history of both that pagan shrine at the ancient Roman baths, but also the medieval abbey and Georgian history. So I love living here. It's a very historical place to live, and sort of inspires quite a lot of stories.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And there's a wonderful reference in your book about the architecture of Bath, but we can get into that a little bit later. So let's just talk a little bit. We're going to talk about your new book, Writing the Shadow, in a moment. But before we do that, let's just talk about your interest in religion and psychology. Particularly, how did you come to your interest in Jung, Carl Jung's psychology in particular?
Yeah, so I first studied psychology at what we call A level here in the UK, which is the age of like 16 to 18. And my teacher, I remember his name, Anthony, was always very into Carl Jung. And because obviously at that level, you don't touch on things in detail. But I remember just feeling like, that's interesting. I enjoyed that side of it. And then as part of my master's degree in theology, at the University of Oxford, I was at Mansfield College, which is actually a theological college. I specialised in psychology of religion, and I did one particular, obviously Jung comes up a lot in psychology of religion, and that kind of started me on the journey. I later did a graduate diploma in psychology. I was going to retrain as a clinical psychologist later on, but I didn't find the clinical side so sort of attracting me as much as the analytical side, the religious side. And of course, you and your listeners know this is not like the clinical side. You're not going to cut into someone's brain and find God there. So I was always much more interested in the numinous, I guess, the spiritual side. And my thesis at university was on obedience to authority figures. So I was so interested, when God tells people in the Bible to do things. So when God says to Abraham, sacrifice your son, and he takes Isaac up to the top of the mountain and it's about to kill his son because God told him to do it. And I was very affected by the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister, by another Jew who said that God told him to do it. And I thought this was just such an interesting idea, that we do things because an authority figure tells us, whether that is God or whatever you might decide is God. But so that really sort of underpinned my interest. And then when I started writing fiction, I just couldn't get away from all these ideas. So my main character, Morgan Sierra, in my Arcane series is a psychologist. And I just keep finding this thing. Jung obviously called it synchronicity, where the sort of coincidences happen over and over again, and you see a pattern. It's more than a coincidence. So yeah, I think I've just always felt drawn to Jung in particular out of all the psychologists.
Yeah,
what about yourself? I should ask yourself.
That's the same, very similar. I took a class in college called The Literature and Psychology of Mysticism, and we read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. That was one of the assigned texts, and that was my introduction to Carl Jung. And for me, I have had a similar path, and my fascination with Jungian psychology is in the area of the numinous, religion, mythology, whereas the clinical aspect I thought was something that would interest me. And I spent a semester at a Jung Institute and just discovered that that's not for me. That's not that it's invalid. It just was not what was interesting to me. In many ways, I tell people that I'm not sure I would continue to be a Christian were it not for Jung's and Jung's followers in their reading, so that there is this symbolic approach to Christianity that has kind of saved me along the way, if you will.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, what is it? I think the only thing in clinical that was really interesting was the sort of brain damage, the temporal lobe epilepsy and things like that, where when stimulated, people do have visions of God. And I found that really interesting. And I put that in one of the books because I find that fascinating. And I'm sure you and many of your listeners have these moments where you feel a spiritual sense, whatever you want to call that. And that moment, the connection between the physical brain and what is above that, the numinous and the places we are and all of that. It's that interaction, obviously, that we both are interested in that goes far beyond biology.
Yes, yeah. And now they're doing work with psilocybin mushrooms and hallucinogens in that whole area. That's interesting because in the Jungian community, that's controversial as to, if you're trying to create something that should more naturally come. But basically, similar idea of trying to get to, what's the source of these spiritual encounters that people have had since there have been human beings.
So
absolutely. You have woven Jung into your work, your fiction work. In particular, I think your first book has references to Carl Jung's Red Book. And so tell us just a little bit about that and your fiction work too in that.
Yeah, sure. Well, interestingly, so the Red Book was only published in 2009. It was, I'm sure you know this, but for your listeners, it was his journal basically written during a breakdown. And it also contains loads of his images that he drew and painted of mandala and other symbols from dreams and thoughts. And it's not really a book you read. I mean, it's all over the place. But I bought a really massive version, a huge oversized, maybe you've got it as well, this Shamdasani translation or something like that. But it's full color. And I got that book. So in 2009, which is when I started writing what became Stone of Fire. And what I love to do with my fiction, my thrillers, is I find this particular series, the Arcane series, is 12 books. I like finding real things that happened in history. And then I take it just a little bit further into supernatural, spiritual, and fiction, obviously. So I was also very interested in the apostles and where the bones of the apostles are around the world. And I was like, I would really like to set some exciting things where the bones of the apostles are. So how could I link all of this stuff together? So I came up with this sort of idea that at the resurrection of Christ, the stone, as we're told in the Bible, breaks apart. And so I was like, well, what if the apostles made necklaces of these stones, and at Pentecost they were enlivened by this spiritual power, and then those stones are handed down through history with the bones of the apostles. And then what if someone found them in modern day time, tried to bring them back together and summon fire down from heaven? So this is kind of all over the place in terms of an idea. But then I was like, there's a picture in the Red Book of a stone with fire coming out. And that there actually is this picture. I did not make this up. And I was like, wow, okay, that's interesting. And I started to try and figure out where Jung got some of these ideas from. And it turns out he was in North Africa in 1920. I wrote it down so I'd remember properly. So he was in North Africa. He did a lot of traveling, obviously. So I had him get one of these stones at that time. And then he also went to the US, to Clark University in 1924 in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so he had a lot of experiences that relate together. So I used the Red Book both in terms of its images to inspire the story, but also as symbols within the book. And yeah, it could be that Carl Jung did have a stone of the apostles, if you want to take it that far.
I love it. I love it. And I love the way you have taken these pieces of history and then wove them into a fiction book and then a whole series, because that's really the beginning of a whole series for people that are listening that like, the work of Dan Brown or that wonderful Umberto Eco book, In the Name of the Rose. I mean, I think this is kind of in the direction that your work is, although obviously it's unique to you and your.
Oh, well, thank you. And I mean, for Americans, I have One Day in New York, which opens at the cloisters. which is a part of the Met Museum that many people don't go to. And it was, all taken over stone by stone from Europe. And they actually, when I was over there, they had this cross relic, this ancient relic that was there in New York. So I've written about New York, and then Valley of Dry Bones, which people might recognize as the verse from Ezekiel. That also relates to the founding of the missions up the west coast of the US into San Francisco. And so I try and also New Orleans, and I find, again, the synchronicity, this is one of my favorite parts of being a fiction author, is I find something in history and then I'm like, that's really interesting in a story. And then at some point, something else will emerge that links to it, and I can see the story emerging that's potential. And I can't really write it until this happens. So my next one, which I don't know what it is yet, but I went to Washington, and there's a Bible, an oversized Bible in the library there, beautiful library in Washington, DC. And so I know somehow that's going to link to something else that is happening in Vienna. And so I just know that at some point it will all click into place. And I do use Jung's synchronicity term, I think, for this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and also it's a wonderful opportunity for you to do travel.
Yes, of course. And I know you like your travel as well.
I love my travel, and I know you do as well. Well, that's great. Wonderful. Excuse me. So now you've written this new book, Writing the Shadow, which is the nonfiction book that's geared towards authors. Although, as I said in one of my emails to you, this really could be, for creatives of a wide variety. But obviously, this is the work that you know. So let's just talk and kind of go into this a little bit. What is the shadow? What do you mean by the shadow? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around that.
Oh, it's kind of unfortunate that he went with that metaphor, because, of course, in the Christian tradition and in many traditions, the darkness is associated with evil. And people think that it's just about writing a horror novel, which, of course, it's not. I mean, for Carl Jung, the shadow is this unconscious aspect of the human personality, the parts of us that we've pushed down because they don't match up to what society expects of us, or that someone has told us is unacceptable, or that we shouldn't behave that way. And there are so many things. I mean, it's not necessarily bad, illegal, immoral, terrible, traumatic, although it can be. And for some people that may lead to those situations. But for many of us, it is just ways we start behaving because maybe a teacher said something, as I've shared, is that a teacher said to me when I wrote a nightmare out on the page, said, you can't write things like that. That's not appropriate for this class. And it took me sort of 20 years before I could write some of this stuff again. But it might also be things that family have told us. Obviously, on a spirituality podcast, religion, and there's a chapter on religion, it can be a huge, both wonderful thing in people's lives, but also it can be full of shadow. For example, I remember, as I was part of the evangelical church, people called backsliders because they weren't behaving in ways that the church said they should, even though that's not necessarily what was in the Bible. People using different labels to put us into a box that we then change our behavior. So it can stem from society, it can stem from our family. There's all these things that Robert Bly has a wonderful metaphor of this invisible bag that we drag behind us. And over the first half of our life, I guess, we stuff all these things into the bag. For me as a British woman, it was very much be quiet. So be quiet, be silent, be gentle, be acceptable to society. Here's one for you, actually. It's not in the book. It's tattoos. Tattoos are really interesting. You're nodding for the audio listeners, but I've noticed that pretty much anyone under 45 in the UK, they have tattoos, just completely it's normal. But a lot of people my age and older, perhaps your generation too, it was not something that nice, in inverted commas, people did. And so if you got a tattoo, there was something wrong with you. And I internalized that for a very long time. And yet now, many of my books now feature characters with tattoos. I'm fascinated with it, but I almost find that that's something I was told was not acceptable. So coming back to the definition, it's really just these things that we society has boxed us in with that we might not even realize. And that's what makes it hard, is how do we find aspects of the shadow if it's unconscious? This is a big challenge, right?
Yes. I remember my psychology and religion professor in seminary, Anne Ulanoff, in class, when she gave this lecture, she started off the class and told this little piece that then, of course, caused me to completely not listen to the rest of the lecture. But I do remember this idea, which is to understand the shadow, think of a person of your own gender whom you just despise, who you really do not like. And for me, it happened to be a professor at the seminary who later became my bishop as a Lutheran pastor. So that was kind of a challenge. But he just had all these qualities that I just thought were just horrible. And as I've gone through my life, I've realized that, yeah, that's my shadow. There's a lot of, aspects of myself that I just, I'm not rigid, and as just one example. And it's an interesting insight into ourselves. I've told that analogy or that little piece to people, and they don't like it because they immediately go to somebody and think, that's not me. What are you talking about?
Yeah, and I feel like, I use the word trigger, but I feel like there might be the word charge. There's a charge on a word. So you said rigid there. See, rigid means nothing to me. It doesn't make me feel anything. So that's not something I need to even think about. But for me, as I share in the book, is the word lazy. And lazy, I am not lazy. I'm definitely
not with 45 books. No, you are not lazy.
I'm not lazy, but if I feel like that word, if I judge people for being lazy, even though my definition of lazy is even somebody relaxing in the park on a weekend, I'm like, they're being lazy, and that is a problem. And this is the point, I guess, as you said too. It's recognizing when these things are harmful, because they're also helping us. So I'm successful because I work hard, and yet because I feel this reaction to lazy, I work too hard. Big thing in your American culture as well, the kind of workaholism, burnout. In fact, I noticed on your blog that you had a blog post about a rest, giving things a rest and embracing the Sabbath. And sometimes I think about this and I really think I wish I could embrace the Sabbath, and it's something that I know I need to fix, and I haven't yet. But so with people listening, it's not necessarily tattoos or being rigid or lazy, but it's anything where you feel this kind of charge, or judgment or fear or shame is a big one. The shame, I remember when I left my church, and I felt ashamed of turning away, and I lost my friends and lost my standing in that community. So yeah, it can be difficult to identify these things, but the whole point, as Jung said, is, how can I be whole unless I have the shadow? We're not trying to get rid of it, we're trying to incorporate it in order to make ourselves whole.
Right. Yeah. There's a wonderful story about Marie-Louise von France, who was a student of Carl Jung's. And she was asked, as she's talking about these kinds of things with shadow, I think it was to a group of women, but I think it applies across gender. She was saying how, each person has in them a voice that says, who are you to think you can do this, whatever it may be? And I guess somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, what can you do to get rid of it? And Marie-Louise von France's response was, you can't get rid of it, but you can educate it. And I think that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about getting rid of anything, because this is a part of humanity. It's a part of who we are. And so let's just talk about, well, why is this important or helpful for authors or creatives or anybody doing any kind of work that really engages with themselves or with other human beings?
Well, for writers and other artists, or anything, could be a vocation, spiritual vocation. Like you said, then who are you to do this? And one of the sort of techniques is calling names, sort of shadow personas. So the inner critic is a massive part of the creative life, and it's interesting because that inner critic will say, your writing's not good enough, you're boring, you don't know anything, you're not good enough to write, all of these things. And many people let that stop them for years, as I did. I wonder what my life would have been like. I mean, I'm very happy with my life, but if I had learned to write at age 12 instead of pushing it aside and believing that I wasn't creative, it took me so long to get to a point where I believed I was creative, because society had basically trained me out of it. And the gifts of creativity and learning more about yourself and also helping other people. So I feel like with this book, if I can help some people with this book, then it's well worth doing. And also I've helped myself because I've learned more about myself. It also helps us be more authentic. So one of the things, I'm sure, I talk about AI and the rise of artificial intelligence. This is not going back in the box. This is part of our life. And I love a lot of AI tools. I'm very positive about AI, but equally, I understand that the writing that AI can do is, let's say, very good average. Like, it's higher than average, but it's not outstanding. And what makes outstanding and what makes connection is the personal touch. And so we have to become more human in order to stand out from what will swiftly become a sea of artificially created art. Now, I am pro AI and I use it as part of my creative process, but I still think we want to connect human to human. So putting our shadow sides into our books, as I've done with this book, I've shared a lot of more personal things. Also, my memoir Pilgrimage, I shared a lot there as well. This actually means that it has more impact on the reader or on the listener if it's audio, or on the viewer if it's visual art or whatever. And these quirks and imperfections and flaws are what connect us. You, for example, saw something in me that connects us, and now we speak, and there's lots that connects us. But that's how we meet other people, I guess, and how we decide what to read and what to listen to. And the listeners find that in you, and I think that's what we need to focus on.
Yeah, and you talk about how this book has been in the oven for a long time for you. What brought it now?
Well, it's interesting. I do feel like my book Pilgrimage really helped and in fact you have a book, Weird Wisdom, about midlife, and I also think midlife has done it for me, in that you get to a point where you really have to question what you want to create with the time that you have, because we all have limited time. And I've been thinking about this book for so many years, and I also feel that I'm coming to a point in my creative career where I want to do different projects, and I've been putting this book off because it's so difficult to write. Like, even trying to define the shadow, like we were talking about, is so hard. But I wanted to try and write this now, without saying, I haven't solved all my issues. Who does? This is the work of a lifetime. But I wanted to put it out now so that I use the metaphor of Plato's chariot, with the white horse and the dark horse running. And my white horse is the sort of the self-help person, the business person. And I want to let my dark horse run a bit more and kind of use my shadow in my own creations more than I have done. So that's kind of why it's now. But I guess I'd ask you, as someone who obviously works with a lot of people, but also your book on midlife, do you think there's something that happens that we're ready to face what's in that bag, for example?
I think that sometimes we're ready to face it, or maybe we have no choice, and whatever is part of the unconscious or the shadow kind of forces itself upon us. If we spend the first half of life at whatever age that is, I think that is shifting. And, Jung talked about it as something in the 30s. I think it's later now. But I think, excuse me, I'm recovering from a bit of a cold. But I think that you get to a certain point where, you spent all that energy on building up yourself, building up your family, your career, your identity, who you are. And then that's why I think religion in particular, but maybe also psychology and spirituality, is something that is a second half of life exploration, if it's done in a more symbolic way. And I just have a bit of a wonder if our dilemma in Christianity in the West in particular is there's a lot of lament about, well, most of the people that go to church are older. Well, maybe there's something there. And maybe we need to think differently and be less anxious about it and just simply acknowledge that's part of life. I was telling you before we started, I had this conversation with this lovely man who's in his 80s, and he'd spent his entire career doing financial planning for people. And now he's writing these little short stories and poetries and self-publishing these books. And, he's not selling more than maybe, double digits, but that's not the important point. Clearly for him, this is part of a creative side that was never explored when he was doing financial planning. And I think that's also the shadow, because the shadow also has gold in it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because perhaps we're so focused on like achieving external measures of success in that first half of life. Obviously, some people still want, I still want success in every way, but I feel like we almost allow ourselves more time. Like I don't expect writing The Shadow to be some breakaway success in terms of a book, but it's a book that for the small number of people who might be interested in this topic, it will help them, in the same way your books help people, and that we find these things at the right time in our lives. I've been very heartened, like my book Pilgrimage. Again, it's interesting you say about the age group. When I walked the Camino de Santiago, most of the walkers were older than me, walking pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. And that was interesting. I didn't really expect that, but they were able to take the time. So whether they were retired, because obviously the amount of time you have to think about these things, or to write that book of your heart, which is what my book is about, really, is writing. But I think it gives us more time, but maybe also an awareness of the short amount of time we do have on earth, and you start to realize that you're on the other side of that curve. And it's interesting you also say about the age group in church, because people say that about books as well. The average age of a reader, like I advertise to people over the age of 50 because they're the ones who buy books. Now other people say, well, those younger people will get older so they will buy books, maybe they'll go to church, all of that kind of thing. But we just have to create for the person that we are right now and see what happens.
Yes, yeah. I think also, and your book Pilgrimage, as you described it, as a midlife transition book as well, I think that there's pieces in that book that people would really resonate with. In the Shadow book and writing The Shadow, there's a couple of things I want to kind of dive in a little bit on two chapters. The first one is on body and shadow. I thought that was really, for me, a very fascinating. And you've really opened yourself up. I applaud you in your very courage and honest. I think a lot of people will resonate with different aspects of it. But this physical body and shadow, that's a new area that I had not spent much time thinking about. Would you mind just saying a little bit more about that and how that played into this book?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I did a lot of research for the book, and there are a lot of books on shadow, as you know, and I don't think this was from a particular book. I think this is something that I just felt myself. And basically, I've always been, and probably you as well, over-educated people like ourselves. We are rewarded from a young age for being book people, for doing good brain work. And so that becomes our focus. And for me, I very much never really considered my body to be that important, as in it carried around my brain, and my important thing was my mind. And even though I wanted to be considered pretty and all of those things, my value is my brain. But what happened was I really didn't look after my body enough. And we talked earlier about working too hard and not being lazy, and so I would spend way too much time hunched over, desks writing. I was at Oxford, and I was, in these little libraries with wooden desks, and for many years, like many people. And then I did desk work, and it got to the point where I actually had this shoulder injury. I couldn't even raise my hand above my head. I couldn't wash my hair in the shower. And I went to a specialist, and he said, you have basically injured your body from your posture over decades. By being hunched over, you've essentially wrenched your scapulars out of where they should be by hunching. And he's like, unless you fix your posture, you are going to have pain-killing injections and maybe surgery. And I was like, wait, what the hell? How did that happen? And it was interesting because when I was reflecting on it for the book, I had literally the unconscious was my body. I went to the gym, I did some walking, whatever, but I did not prioritize looking after my physical self, because it just wasn't important to me. But also I'd been rewarded for my brain. And yet, as we were talking about with the shadow, if you don't deal with these things, they come raging back, like the balloons you try and push under the water. At some point, they are going to get you. And it's very difficult to talk about this in today's society because of we should rightly be happy with our body situation and looking after ourselves, but it becomes quite political to even talk about these things. But unless we deal with some of the shadow issues around our bodies, I also mention things like food and wanting to eat sugar because that was my reward for doing well academically. If I did well, if I got an A, I would get rewarded with food, but it was bad food like cakes and chocolate and things, and then that became associated with being good. And I mean, these things just become so complicated. But unless we admit some of the problems around our physical selves, they will come back and get us. And so many people are struggling with issues around their physical bodies. It is difficult, though. I don't know. Why were you so interested in this chapter in particular?
I guess for me, I like you, tend to live in my head. And my spiritual director, part of my work is she's asking, where in your body do you sense that? Where in your body do you feel that? Which is new for me, that somebody would ask those kinds of questions, to actually consciously meditate and place where, is it in my lungs? Am I gasping short of breath? Is it in my gut? Is it in my legs? It's just very fascinating to think about how these things manifest in our body. And so this is a whole new area for me. And I think seeing that in your book was like, okay, there it is again, like a synchronicity kind of experience. And I'm just very intrigued by the mind-body connection in this whole area.
I mean, obviously, there are some people who do have deep trauma around
Yes.
body issues, and for them, that's kind of a very difficult situation. I guess for me, that's not even what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about how pushing the care of the physical body into the shadow has resulted in injury. And there's a really interesting book called Desk Bound by Dr. Kelly Starrett. And basically, people who do desk work have more injuries than most other jobs. And it's like, I'm sorry, how did that happen in our society that we have all these people in pain? And when you ask people in America, particularly because you have more access to drugs than we have here in the UK, we can barely get an ibuprofen from the chemist. But there's a lot of cultural, societal issues around painkillers now that stem from some of the other collective shadow issues, I guess, we have in society, that then results in more stigma for people and this kind of, effect down the line. So yeah, it would be good if we maybe would focus on that more. But then if we come back to religion, the body is such a fraught area
Yes.
in so many ways, and it's become very political to talk about aspects of the physical body. So yeah, I understand how difficult this is for people, but I guess what we're saying is, as an individual, you don't have to talk to anyone else about it. Have a think about whether some of those issues that you've repressed are manifesting in your body somehow.
Right. And you touched on just briefly their religion and physical body versus the mind body split. The spirit and body are separate things, which I don't think were a part of the initial intent of this, but Western Enlightenment kind of pulled them apart. I think we are now getting to a point where we're starting to see there is an integration of these two things. That's the other piece in your book. Just the one other thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up here is the chapter on the collective shadow. I thought was quite insightful. And you know, as we think about the shadows, not just something individually, but in society as a whole, Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. But you have this great line. I just love this. There's where nuance and balance are lost, the shadow emerges. And then you follow it up with just asking the reader where they might be seeing this now, which is just such a delightful way of doing it. Like, I don't need to tell you. If you can't see this, I can't help you. So I thought that was great. And then, you know, that later in that chapter, this quote by Robert Johnson, the tendency to see one's shadow out there in a neighbor, in another race or culture, is the most dangerous aspect of the modern psyche. There's a lot in that that's very, very powerful. Say a little bit more about collective shadow and the individual's role in all of this.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because that chapter originally was really, really long. And I wrote tons and tons of words about all these aspects of collective shadow. The thing, like in the UK, we have a lot of race issues and, you know, empire, the end of empire and all these kinds of things. And I wrote some stuff about America. And then in the end, I was like, do you know what? Every single sentence in this chapter will trigger someone that will basically say, that's not us. I'm not like that. And I was like, in the end, so as you say, what I did was reframe everything in questions to try and make people think about the nuance. And it's interesting. And I've been thinking about a lot, because of course here in Europe we have the Ukraine war, and so the question of war is very interesting. So there are people who believe all war is bad. There are people who believe all war is justified. And then in the middle, there is a massive spectrum and a nuance with individual situations. And the collective shadow situation, I think, stems from, well, an individual might be influenced, for example, by a military family. You know, if your father and your grandfather and your mother and everything were in the military, then you have a certain opinion that someone who comes from a very different background might not have. And then you've got a culture that is used to, not naming anyone, that is used to imposing their values by just getting on some ships and planes and going over somewhere and doing something. And of course, I put the UK in that bracket as much as the US. I mean, when you can do that power shift has a very different view to the person who might be anti-war because their home gets bombed. So I think the point is that the collective unconscious, the collective shadow can be out of our control, because we can't necessarily impact this huge span of history that's going on. But what we can do is look at ourselves and try and find nuance where we are. So instead of reacting, so for example, I was in New York one time and had a discussion with someone who was very pro-gun, and the way he dressed and the way he spoke, his accent, made me judge him in a certain way based on a few things that I learned about him. And then later on I heard him speak, and he seemed a completely different person, and it really made me feel like I just judged that guy because of his attitude toward this one thing that triggered me in some way. But actually there's a lot more to this person. And I guess one of the ideas with the collective shadow is we tend to think that the shadow is the opposite to what we believe. And this is the problem with the polarization in your culture and my culture politically, is like, well, I believe this, and they're in the shadow, they're the dark ones, they're the evil ones. But of course, that's where the nuance is lost. And we can only fix this one person by one person. So I guess the challenge to listeners and to us as well is, when you feel like you're judging someone based on one particular criteria, then try and find some other things about them where you can find more common ground and where you might agree on other things, in order to bring that nuance into an increasingly fraught world, I guess. I mean, religion is a classic one. I mean, how the schisms in you're Lutheran, right? I mean, there's so many issues in religions between some really little things. It's crazy.
Absolutely. And that's reminding me of an old joke that I'm not going to be able to pull up all of the pieces right now, about where a couple of men meet and they're, oh, you're Baptist, which group? And they kind of keep dissecting down to, like, this, and, oh, you're on my side, then they discover at the very end, like, oh, you're from the eastern side of the city Baptist, and I'm from the western side, and then they call the other heathen, or something like that. But yeah, religion is fraught with that, and we do that all the time. Well, let's wrap up with one more question, and then you can tell us a little bit where we can find this book and your work. So one of the pieces you point to is, where our shadow is, there is also our gold. And this is a metaphor that's in a lot of fairy tales, and it's even in parables of Jesus and other religions too, that this idea that the shadow there's a gold there. Maybe we can kind of close with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it also goes with the sort of the buried treasure that you have to get through some dirt to find, and that you need a bit of effort to figure out, to find that which you've buried for so long. And I think the gold for me can be both the creative potential. So as I said, for me, very much I was told that I couldn't write certain things, and then I found creative success in both the sort of happiness, but also financially it has turned into actual gold, in terms of it's my living now to be a creative. It doesn't have to be for everyone, but also the gold in terms of helping yourself. So you might find something out about yourself or your family or society that suddenly give you a new perspective, and that might change your life. And I think that's the aim with my book, is if we can just help people find an aspect that might improve their life, then that it makes it worthwhile. And for creating writing books and poems or art or whatever, then you can help other people. But also, I guess for me personally, it's changing my perspective on what I want to create, and try to just really tap into that much more, what is uniquely me that other people will resonate with. And what I love about this conversation is I really love talking about spirituality and religion, but I'm not a Christian. So I have actually felt quite shut out from the spiritual community, because we not disagree, but there's something that I don't have, even though I write about these types of things. And I think actually you've encouraged me to think about talking about it more from that perspective, because I'm often afraid that I'm too religious for the non-religious and not religious enough for the other people. So I think the gold in the shadow can be many things, and each person has to find what that gold is, but you may have to do a bit of digging to find it, but it is worthwhile.
Yeah, it is worthwhile, because then life just becomes richer and more meaningful. There's more depth to it, and I find you have engaging conversations with people like this one that we've had. This has been delightful. So now, finding this book is, for people that are listening to this, so we're recording this, it's October 2nd. It'll be out later this week in 2023. So in the far different future, people will have no problem finding this book. But in the immediate future, you're launching this in a creative way as a Kickstarter. So I'll put the links to everything in the show notes for people, but just tell us a little bit about how you're launching this book and maybe why.
So one of the wonderful things about the Kickstarter is it's kind of a pre-ordering crowdfunding idea. So you say, yes, I really want a copy of this book. And I have a special edition, which has got gold foil and it's got a ribbon and it's a lovely hardback. And that is available in the Kickstarter, as well as paperbook, ebook, audiobook that I narrate, workbook and all these other things. So it runs 9th to the 25th of October 2023, but the link will then redirect to wherever books are found. So it's thecreativepn.com/shadowbook, and we can put that link in the show notes, and then that will redirect. It will be for sale everywhere in all formats by the end of the year elsewhere, and also on my website, creativepenbooks.com. So it will be available everywhere. If people go to that link, it will redirect.
Oh, wonderful. This has been a great conversation. And I encourage people to find the book. I think they'll find it very helpful and meaningful. And it's a great read for people that want an introduction to shadow. I think this is up there with, Robert Johnson's book and Robert Bly's book.
And I'm thrilled.
It's a great entree into it. And I encourage people. Thanks so much, Joanna.
Thanks so much. And also, if people are interested in writing, the Creative Penn podcast, Penn with a double N, if people fancy coming on over there.
Yeah, that's every Monday, I think,
yes,
is when it comes out. Yeah, good.
Indeed.
Well, great being with you.
Thanks so much, Jim.